There is a town in Connecticut where nothing unusual ever happens. Small roads, old money, gates that open without a sound and close the same way. On a Tuesday morning in September, a pickup truck with a Stamford license plate pulled up a bluestone driveway and parked in front of a 6-bay garage the size of a small house. The man who got out was nobody, a mechanic, work shirt, clean hands, a roll bag of tools he had been adding to since he was 23 years old. He walked into that garage. He opened the hood of a 1973 Porsche. He looked inside for 11 seconds and stopped breathing. Because what he saw, hidden beneath 30 years of silence, beneath a dead man's devotion, beneath a crime that no accountant had caught and no lawyer had found, was the handwriting of a ghost. Someone he had learned from, someone who had been gone for 8 years. And everything that came next started right there, in 11 seconds, in a garage in Greenwich. The morning it started, Daniel Mercer was under a BMW. Not metaphorically, literally under it. On a creeper board, on the cold concrete of Bay 2, with a flashlight in his left hand and a socket extension in his right, looking at valve seals that had given up somewhere around 80,000 miles and decided to make everyone aware of it. He had been there since 6:40. It was a Tuesday in September. The kind of Tuesday that arrives without announcement and leaves the same way. The air through the open bay door was cool, but not cold yet. The particular temperature of early fall in Connecticut, when summer has technically ended, but has not fully accepted this. His daughter Claire was upstairs in the apartment above the shop, eating cereal at the kitchen table, the colored circles kind. The kind Sarah had never allowed. Daniel allowed it every morning now except Saturday, when he made pancakes. And Wednesday, when he made eggs, because some structure was necessary, and some flexibility was necessary, and figuring out which was which had taken him 3 years, and he was still adjusting. Claire was 7. She would be 8 in February. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness and a wooden toy car that she carried everywhere, carved from black walnut by Daniel's father the week she was born. 2 inches long, 4 wheels that turned. She had held it in the hospital at 2 days old with an expression of complete seriousness, as if she had been expecting exactly this and was satisfied with the result. And she still carried it, every day, in her coat pocket, in her backpack, in her hand at the dinner table. Daniel had stopped asking her to put it away at meals approximately 2 years ago. Some battles clarify themselves over time. He was 38 years old. He ran Mercer's Auto on Pacific Street in Stamford, Connecticut. 2 bays, 1 lift, 2 tool chests he had been adding to since 2009 when he was 23, and convinced that the right set of sockets was the most important thing a person could own. He knew better now, but he kept adding to the chests. The shop had 3 cars in it that morning. The BMW M5 he was currently under, a 2018 Audi RS5 with a transmission cooler running 10 degrees hot under load, and a 1995 Mercedes 500e that belonged to a doctor named Caldwell from New Canaan, who had been bringing it to Daniel for 6 years, and who called it Margaret, which was not something Daniel acknowledged verbally, but which he had written on the work order in parentheses the first time, because it helped with filing. He worked by referral only, had since 2022. The reputation had built itself through a narrow channel of European automotive enthusiasts who had learned, through experience or through other people's experience, that Daniel Mercer could find problems that other people could not. He did not advertise this. He did not need to. His phone rang at 9:18. He rolled out from under the BMW, checked his hands, decided they were clean enough, and answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Organized, efficient. The voice of someone who had been managing other people's schedules long enough that her own voice had started to sound like a well-run calendar. Mr. Mercer, my name is Donna. I'm calling on behalf of Mrs. Margaret Holt of Greenwich. She was referred to you by Dr. Caldwell leaned against the workbench. She has a 1973 Porsche Carrera RS. It's been presenting a diagnostic problem for approximately 18 months. 3 shops have examined it. No one has resolved the issue. What's it doing? Donna read from something. A list. Intermittent misfire at idle, worse on cold starts. Pressure loss in the dry sump after extended driving. Diagnostic codes that appeared and then disappeared without correlation to any visible mechanical fault. 2 shops had pulled the engine completely. Found nothing structurally wrong, reassembled. Problem returned within 100 miles both times. Daniel was quiet for a moment. A 1973 Carrera RS that runs clean for 90 miles and then starts misfiring is not a broken part. It is a conversation between two parts that have stopped agreeing. Finding the source of that disagreement requires either luck or someone who has been inside the same engine before and knows both voices. When can Mrs. Holt see me? She's available today, 11:30. He looked at the BMW, looked at the clock above the bay door. Tell her I'll be there. He ended the call, phoned Mrs. Sullivan downstairs to confirm she would collect Claire from Stamford Academy at 3. Washed up. Changed into the clean work shirt with his name above the left pocket. Assembled a roll bag with the diagnostic tools appropriate for an air-cooled flat 6 from the early 70s. Nothing extra. Nothing he would not use. He went upstairs first. Claire was still at the table, cereal bowl pushed aside, drawing something on a piece of paper with a blue crayon. She did not look up when he came in. I have a job in Greenwich, he said. Mrs. Sullivan is picking you up. Okay. Still drawing. What are you making? She held it up. A house. A car in front of it. The car was mostly a rectangle with 4 circles underneath, which was Claire's architectural shorthand for vehicle. Is that our building? It's a practice, she said, which was her way of saying she was not sure yet and did not want to commit. He kissed the top of her head. She went back to the drawing. He was on I-95 North by 10:15. The gate was iron. The driveway was bluestone. The house at the end of it was white clapboard with a slate roof, and the kind of proportions that came from decades of careful maintenance rather than recent construction. 6 chimneys. A pool to the south that was longer than Daniel's entire shop floor. Roses along the east garden wall doing something that had clearly required professional consultation. A young man at the gatehouse checked his name against a printed list and waved him around toward the south side of the property without speaking. The detached garage was larger than Daniel's apartment. 6 bays, doors already open. The floor inside was cleaner than most operating rooms. A woman stood alone between the pool and the garage, 68 years old, silver hair cut close to her head. Good posture, the earned kind. Dark slacks, low heels, a cardigan that was expensive in the way that did not announce itself. She had a coffee cup in her left hand and a phone in her cardigan pocket, and the expression of someone who had learned, over a long time, how to watch people without appearing to. Margaret Holt. Daniel had looked her up before leaving Stamford. Harold Holt's widow. Harold had built Holt Capital Management across 35 years, a mid-sized fund known for patience and occasional prescience. He had died 14 months ago. A Tuesday morning in July 2023. Heart attack at the kitchen table. Margaret had taken over as managing trustee and brought in Warren Sloan, Harold's longtime operations director, to handle the day-to-day. Standing beside her now was Warren Sloan, 52, heavier than his professional photograph suggested, a tan that came from somewhere warmer than Connecticut. He had the smile of a man who had practiced it until it arrived automatically, just ahead of whatever he was actually thinking. Behind them both, slightly to the left, stood Donna, the voice from the phone, mid-30s, tablet in hand, ready. Daniel got out of the truck and walked over. Margaret came forward first, extended her hand. Firm grip, direct eye contact. Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming on short notice. Happy to. This is Warren Sloan, my partner at the fund. And Donna, who you spoke with. Warren shook Daniel's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who had decided in advance to be unimpressed. 3 certified shops have already gone through this car, he said, including the Porsche dealer in White Plains. I want to be upfront about that. Daniel looked at him. What were they diagnosing? The misfire, the pressure issue. Were they familiar with the car's restoration history? Warren's smile held. I assume so. The Porsche dealer in White Plains works on late-model cars primarily. A 1973 Carrera RS with a non-factory restoration is a different animal. If they didn't know the modification history, they were diagnosing the wrong engine. A beat of silence. Margaret said, "Can I show you the car?" "Please." 5 cars inside, a black Range Rover, a silver G-Class, a red Ferrari from this decade, a Bentley the color of deep water on a cloudy day. And in the second bay from the right, white, Grand Prix white, which is a specific shade that Porsche used in the early 70s, and which photographs badly but in person has a depth that stops you. Red Carrera script along the lower rocker panels, the ducktail spoiler at the rear. The proportions of a car that was built to be driven hard and knew it. Daniel stopped at the nose, not for the obvious reasons. He stopped because the car sat slightly lower on the driver's side than the passenger's side, which was not a factory characteristic of this model but was a known result of a specific suspension geometry adjustment that a very small number of people had applied to cars from this era. An adjustment that corrected for weight distribution under hard cornering on long track sessions or extended mountain driving. He knew this adjustment. He had watched it being made. He walked to the rear of the car, put his hand on the engine cover, looked at Margaret. Unlocked? Yes. He lifted it. The air filter housing was original to the period, with the oxidization pattern of something that had been used rather than stored. The fan shroud was correct. Original factory paint visible on the underside. The flat six sat exactly as it should, a compact, dense arrangement of components that had powered some of the most significant racing cars of the early 1970s, and that still 50 years later communicated a kind of purposeful authority when you looked at it straight. And then Daniel saw the bracket, lower left side of the engine bay, partially behind the wiring harness, hand-fabricated. The geometry was not factory. The weld lines were not from any production facility. The bracket angled at a compensation pattern that Daniel had seen twice in his life. Once at Lime Rock Park in the spring of 2009, when he was 23 years old and barely qualified to hand tools to the man who was installing it. Once in a garage in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that fall, when the same man had spent 3 hours explaining to him why the angle mattered and what it was compensating for, and what happened to oil pressure under sustained lateral load when you got the geometry wrong. Roy Patton. Daniel crouched, took a microfiber cloth from his pocket, cleaned the lower edge of the bracket carefully, a small stamp, 2 letters, 2 numbers. RP03, Roy Patton, third personal restoration outside his official track work. Private projects, cars that someone brought to him and that he decided deserved his full attention. Daniel had been present for the 4th one in Lancaster in 2009. He had watched those hands work for an entire weekend. He had learned more in those 2 days than in the previous year combined. Roy had died in March of 2016. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. Daniel had driven to Lancaster for the funeral, stood in a Methodist church with people he did not know, and listened to a pastor describe a man he clearly had not spent enough time with. Driven home the same day without talking to anyone. He had not been back to Lancaster since. He straightened up. Closed the engine cover partway, did not latch it. He could feel everyone behind him. Warren's impatience, Donna's quiet attention. And Margaret, standing slightly apart, watching with something he had not yet been able to read. "I need to ask you something," Daniel said. "Go ahead," Margaret said. "When did your husband acquire this car?" A pause. In 1994. He bought it from a collector here in Connecticut. The collector had commissioned a full restoration some years before and decided to sell. Harold bought it as a finished car. Why? "Do you know who did the restoration work?" She thought for a moment. Harold never mentioned a name. He didn't talk about the car's history much. He just drove it. How often? Twice a week. Tuesday mornings and Saturdays. She said it without sentimentality. Just fact. He didn't miss unless the weather was bad, and sometimes not even then. Daniel looked at the bracket through the gap in the engine cover. Twice a week for 30 years. Tuesday mornings and Saturdays. "The car has a non-factory modification in the engine bay," he said. "It was installed by a specific individual, and I believe I know who that was. The problem your car is having is not the engine itself. It's what someone replaced in the engine in the last 2 years. And they replaced it in a way that creates a conflict with that original modification." Warren made a sound. 3 certified shops. "We're looking at a car they didn't have the history for," Daniel said. "The modification I'm describing doesn't appear in any factory service manual. If you don't know it's there, you can't diagnose what happens when it's disturbed." Silence. "How long to fix it?" Margaret asked. 3 days, possibly 4 if I need to source a specific part. "What do you need from us?" "Access to the car, a clean workspace, to be left alone while I work." Something moved at the edge of Margaret's expression. "That seems reasonable." She looked at Donna. "Have Danny open the far bay and clear the workbench." Then back to Daniel. "Tomorrow morning? 8 o'clock. The gate code will be on your phone by this evening." She extended her hand again. Same grip, same eye contact. Daniel shook it and walked back to the truck. He did not look back at Warren Sloan. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looked through the windshield at the bluestone driveway and the roses along the east wall, and the October light coming through the tree line at the angle it comes through in Connecticut when the season is turning. RP03. He started the truck. He picked Claire up from Mrs. Sullivan's at 4:30. She came down the stairs from the Sullivan apartment, with her backpack on one shoulder and the wooden car in her right hand, already talking before she reached the bottom step. Mrs. Sullivan made soup and it had things in it I didn't recognize, and I ate them anyway, because she looked like she wanted me to. That was polite. I know. I'm a polite person. She followed him into the shop and sat on the stool near the workbench while he put his roll bag away. Did you fix the Porsche? I looked at it. I'm going back tomorrow. Was it hard? It's going to take a few days. She swung her feet, turned the wooden car over in her hands, examining the wheels the way she sometimes did when she was thinking about something else. Mrs. Sullivan says Porsches are fancy. Some of them are. Is this one fancy? Daniel thought about the Grand Prix White. The ducktail. Roy's bracket catching the garage light. It's special, he said. Different thing. Claire seemed satisfied with this distinction. She put the car in her pocket and went upstairs to do homework. He followed her up, made pasta. Simple, the kind that didn't require much attention, because he needed part of his mind elsewhere. They ate at the kitchen table with the window above the bays going dark outside. Claire told him about a disagreement at recess that had involved a disputed rule in a game he did not fully understand. He listened to all of it. After she was in bed, he sat at the table with his phone. He called Gerald Ash at 7:15. Gerald was 71 years old, retired. He lived in a house in Yonkers that his daughter had given up trying to redecorate approximately 15 years ago, because every surface had something on it related to Porsches or Ferraris or the road circuits of the American Northeast. Gerald had worked alongside Roy Patton at Lime Rock Park for almost 15 years. He was the person Daniel called when he needed someone who had been in the room. Gerald picked up on the third ring. Mercer. Gerald, I need to confirm something. It's 7 in the evening. I know. A pause, a television being muted. Fine. What? Roy built 7 private restorations outside his track work. Personal projects. I was present for one. Do you know the full sequence? Which cars? Which years? Silence on the other end. Longer than expected. Why are you asking me this? Because I think I just saw one. Another pause. Different quality. Slower. Ware Greenwich. 1973 Porsche Carrera RS Grand Prix White. Bracket has an RP03 stamp. Gerald exhaled. Not quickly. The exhale of someone adjusting to new information. That's the third one. Roy did that car in 1993 for a collector. The man brought it to him in rough condition. Said he wanted it done correctly or not at all. Roy spent 7 months on it. Said afterward it was the best air-cooled flat 6 he had ever worked on, and that it deserved better than it had gotten. Do you know who the collector was? Roy never tracked the cars after they left. Said his job ended when the car drove out of his garage. The current owner's husband bought it from a Connecticut collector in 1994. The timeline fits. Who's the current owner? Margaret Holt, widow. Her husband Harold died 14 months ago, July 2023. She called me about a misfire that 3 shops couldn't diagnose. Gerald was quiet. Roy would have appreciated that, he said finally. Someone getting the car to a person who could hear it. Daniel did not respond to that directly. He looked at the kitchen window, at the dark above the bays, at the small scratch on the table where Claire's crayon had slipped that morning. Gerald. Roy kept records. He did. What happened to them? His daughter has them. Still in Lancaster. Roy left her the shop records, the tools, everything. She kept the records. Said she wasn't ready to do anything with them yet. That was 8 years ago, and I don't think she's changed her mind. But she might make an exception if the reason was good enough. Do you have a way to reach her? I might. Why do you need the records? Daniel looked at his notes from the garage. At the photographs on his phone. At the part number he had written in the margin and circled. Because someone replaced the oil scavenge pump with an aftermarket unit. It's the right part for a different application, and the wrong part for this engine. And it was installed in a way that specifically defeats Roy's bracket. I need to understand the original specification well enough to prove what was changed. A long silence. That's not an accident, Gerald said. No. You don't install a part that way by accident, not on an engine like this. No, Mercer. Yeah. What are you going to do with what you found? Daniel was quiet for a moment. The right thing, he said, whatever that costs. Gerald didn't say anything for a few seconds. I'll call Elaine in the morning, he said. I'll let you know what she says. They ended the call. Daniel sat at the table. He did not reach for his phone again. He did not open his laptop. He just sat with what he knew and what it meant and what it was going to require of him. He thought about Roy. Roy Patton had never talked about the people who brought him cars. Never talked about what happened to the cars after they left. But he had talked once about why he kept records. Said it was not about pride, not about proof. Said it was because the work deserved to be remembered even if the person who did it was forgotten. Said those were two different things and people confused them. Daniel had been 23. He had not entirely understood. He was 38 now. He understood. He was at the estate at 8:53 the next morning. The gate code Donna had texted worked on the first try. A different young man was at the gatehouse. His name was on the list. The garage doors were already open. A man in coveralls was waiting near the Porsche. Mid-20s, dark hair, straightforward expression. Introduced himself as Danny. Mrs. Holt said to help with anything you need. Clean bench, a power outlet, and an address I can use for parts delivery if I need to order something overnight. Otherwise, I work alone. Danny nodded once and pointed to a workbench along the far wall that was already cleaner than Daniel's primary bench in Stamford. He showed him 3 outlets, gave him a delivery address and a contact name, and left without asking any further questions. Good. Daniel set up. He spent the first 90 minutes doing nothing except document 24 photographs of the engine bay from different angles. Every part number he could read written down in sequence. Every modification noted and described. Every measurement he could take without removing a single component. He did this slowly. He did this completely. Because before you fix something, you must be able to prove what it looked like before you touched it. Not paranoia, discipline. Roy's first rule, delivered the morning of Daniel's first real job in that Lancaster garage. Know what you walked into. So you can prove what you found. And so you can prove what you didn't break. At 9:40 he heard footsteps on the stone floor. Margaret came in wearing slacks and a cream-colored sweater, her silver hair slightly looser than the day before. She carried the same style of coffee cup. She moved to the workbench, looked at his notes, looked at the photographs laid out on his phone, and did not touch anything. You've been here since before 9, 8:53. She looked at the photographs. What are you doing right now? Documenting. Before anything comes apart. Why is that the first step? Because if something is missing later, I need to be able to show it was missing when I arrived. Not after. She was quiet for a moment. That's a careful way to work. It's the only way to work on a car like this. She looked at the Porsche. Her expression shifted in a way that was not quite sadness but was adjacent to it. Harold drove it for 30 years and never had a day of trouble. Then he was gone, and within 6 months it started having problems. She paused. I used to think that was a coincidence. Daniel said nothing. He noted a measurement. He never let anyone else drive it, she continued. Not me, not our son, not Warren, and Warren asked twice. A pause. I thought it was eccentric at the time. Now I think he understood something about the car that he couldn't explain. So he protected it the only way he could. Daniel thought about Roy's bracket, about what it did and why the angle mattered, and how long Roy had worked to arrive at that specific geometry. About the fact that Harold had driven the car twice a week for 30 years, and the car had run correctly the whole time. Because Harold had not let anyone else touch it. And then Harold was gone. Mrs. Holt, Margaret. When I'm finished, I'm going to tell you what I found. Fully. I'd like you to hear it directly from me. Not through anyone else. She looked at him. Warren Sloane's name was not in the room, but it was present. All right, she said. She finished her coffee, set the cup at the far end of the bench, well away from his tools, and walked back toward the house. Daniel returned to the engine bay. By noon he had what he needed. The oil scavenge pump aftermarket, from a manufacturer in California that made reliable parts for restoration builds that prioritized performance over period accuracy. The part itself was well made. It would have functioned correctly in a dozen other applications. Not this one. The installation required 4 distinct steps. Each step required the installer to work around something already present. Each step required them to see Roy's bracket and understand what it was doing, and choose to proceed in a direction that defeated it. You could not do this accidentally. You could not do this without knowledge of what you were working against. Someone had known, and had worked against it on purpose. Daniel stood at the bench. He took out his phone, pulled up SEC Edgar. Found the most recent Form ADV filing for Holt Capital Management. 47 pages. He read the relevant sections carefully. Page 32. The schedule of principal assets held as collateral against the personal credit line Harold had established in 2019. Real estate. 2 vehicles. Equipment stored at a facility in Fairfield County. The 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS, valued at $390,000. Filing dated July 2024. Daniel put the phone down, picked it up, ran auction comparables. A clean Carrera RS from the same year with verified history had sold at a Pennsylvania auction house in June 2024 for $1.30 million. Another in California in March of the same year for $51 million, both without documented named restorer provenance. A car with a confirmed Roy Patton private restoration documented in his own records was not in the same category as those sales. Roy had a reputation in the vintage circuit. Small, not famous, but specific. Among the people who knew this era of Porsche motorsport, Roy Patton's name on a car meant something definite. Conservative estimate with provenance. $4 million, possibly more. The car was on Holt Capital's books at $390,000. That was not an appraisal error. An error goes in any direction. It has the shape of randomness. What Daniel was looking at had the shape of intention. Someone had looked at this car and looked at its value, and written down a number that was $1 million short of what any informed assessment would have produced. And someone had also gone into the engine bay of the same car and made changes that would prevent an informed assessor from recognizing it for what it was. The person with authority over the fund's asset documentation since Harold's death. The person who had managed all external contractor relationships, including whoever had touched this car. Warren Sloan. Daniel did not move for a while. Outside the open bay doors, the lawn was green in the October light. Somewhere on the far side of the main house, someone was raking leaves. The Porsche sat white and quiet in its bay. He thought about Margaret saying Harold understood something about the car that he couldn't explain. He thought about what Harold had protected for 30 years. And about what had started happening to it within 6 months of Harold no longer being here to protect it. He put his tools away carefully, photographed the bench before he left, locked the roll bag, sent Gerald a text. Need Elaine's records as soon as she can. Not urgent, but important. Gerald replied in 4 minutes, already called her. She's pulling the 1993 files tonight. Daniel drove home. He had dinner to make, a daughter to pick up, and tomorrow he had a car to fix. One thing at a time. That was how Roy had always worked. One thing at a time, done completely before the next thing began. Daniel could do that. He had learned from the right person. The replacement part arrived Wednesday morning. Brown cardboard box, a flame logo on the side. Performance engineered in red letters that were trying to convey authority. Daniel set it on the workbench without opening it and finished his coffee first. Then he opened it. The oil scavenge pump inside was well machined, clean tolerances, good finish. The kind of component that would perform reliably in a dozen different applications and never give anyone a moment of concern. He turned it in his hands for a while. This was not a cheap substitute. Whoever had ordered this part had spent real money on it. Had gone to the trouble of sourcing something that would not fail immediately, would not trigger obvious warning signs, would run acceptably for a while before the thermal expansion cycle brought it out of alignment with Roy's bracket, and started producing the intermittent symptoms that 3 shops had spent 18 months failing to trace. That was the point, he realized. Not to break the car, obviously. To degrade it gradually. To create a diagnostic mystery that looked like age, like the unpredictable behavior of a 50-year-old machine, like the kind of problem that made a car difficult to value accurately. He set the aftermarket pump on the bench beside the original he had removed the day before, looked at them side by side. The original was Roy's specification. Period correct. The scavenge port geometry matched the bracket angle exactly, a collaboration between 2 components that had been designed to work together. The replacement was simply a different answer to a different question, functional in isolation, wrong in context. Danny knocked on the open bay door at 9. Mrs. Holt asks if you need anything. I'm good. Tell her I should have it running by this afternoon. Danny nodded and left. Daniel went to work. He had sourced the correct replacement pump 3 days earlier through Walter Brennan, a contact in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who maintained a private inventory of new old stock Porsche components from the early 70s in a climate-controlled unit outside the city. The part had arrived overnight. The price had been significant. He had already added it to the invoice without concern. The installation was straightforward once the incorrect part was out. The correct pump seated against Roy's bracket, with the precision of two things that had been designed for each other, which they had been, which was the whole point, which was what made the deliberate installation of the wrong part so legible once you knew what you were looking at. He torqued every fastener to specification, ran a pressure test, nominal on the first attempt, ran it again to be certain. Nominal. He started the car at 1:15 in the afternoon. The flat six woke up with the particular sound of an engine that has been correctly assembled and knows it. Not loud. Exact. A mechanical agreement between components that were operating within their design tolerances, which is a different sound than anything else, and which Daniel had learned to recognize from Roy in that Lancaster garage when he was 23 and had not yet understood why the difference mattered. He let it idle for 22 minutes. Cold cycle to warm, no misfire at any point. He called Danny in to watch the gauges while he walked around the car listening. Clean throughout. He took it out at 2 o'clock. Through the gate and north on North Street and then east on routes he had looked up the night before. A loop through the back roads of Greenwich into the lower edge of Westchester County and back, designed to give him 45 minutes of varied driving with enough sustained sections to bring the engine fully up to temperature and hold it there. The car was immediately different from anything else he drove regularly. This was not a compliment toward anything else he drove. It was simply the reality of a machine that had been built without compromise for a specific purpose, and then maintained for 30 years, by someone who understood what it was. The steering communicated directly. The engine sat close enough to his back that he could feel the vibration through the seat, not as noise but as information, the mechanical conversation of a flat six working correctly at speed. He drove it the way Harold would have driven it on a Tuesday morning, not fast for the sake of fast. Attentively, with the windows down far enough to hear the exhaust note change through corners. With his hands relaxed on the wheel because fighting a well-set-up car is the surest sign that you do not understand it. 30 miles out, 15 back, no misfire at any point, pressure held throughout. He came back through the gate at 2:53 and pulled into the garage and sat for a moment after he turned the engine off. The ticking of the cooling metal in the quiet of the bay, that specific sound. He got out, covered the car with the breathable cloth cover that had been draped over the workbench. Cleaned his tools, reorganized the roll bag. Margaret came into the garage at 3:10. She had changed into different slacks and a darker cardigan. She looked at the covered car and then at Daniel. "It's running," he said. "I could hear it from the kitchen when you came back through the gate." She paused. "I haven't heard it run like that since Harold. I'd like you to drive it before I give you my final assessment. So you can confirm yourself." She looked at the cover. "Now, whenever you're ready." She was ready in 4 minutes. She came back wearing driving gloves, which told Daniel something about her relationship with this car that had not been visible before. You do not own driving gloves by accident. You own them because at some point you understood that the connection between your hands and a steering wheel is something worth taking seriously. He removed the cover. She got in, adjusted the seat with the focus of someone doing it correctly, not quickly. Started the engine and listened to it for a moment before she put it in gear. She drove down the driveway at a pace that suggested she was relearning something. By the time she reached the gate, she had already found it. She was gone for 38 minutes. Daniel sat on the tailgate of his truck and waited. The October afternoon was cooling. The roses along the east garden wall had gone to their late-season color, a deeper red than their summer version. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a dog was barking in the unhurried way of a dog with nothing specific to worry about. The Porsche came back through the gate at 3:51. Margaret pulled it into the garage and turned the engine off and sat for a moment before she got out. When she did, she closed the door with deliberate care, the way you handle something that has just reminded you of its value. She walked to where Daniel was standing near the truck. Harold was right, she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. What do I owe you? $800 a day for 3 working days. The part was $460. Total comes to $2860. I want to pay you more than that. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. Margaret, you pay me what the work cost. That's the agreement. She looked at him for a moment, then took out her phone and made the transfer. He felt his phone confirm it 30 seconds later. She was about to say something else when Daniel reached into his chest pocket and took out a business card. Frank Calder, attorney at law, Stamford, Connecticut. His direct line written on the back in Daniel's handwriting. He held it out. Margaret looked at it. Looked at him. What is this? An attorney in Stamford, he handles matters like this. Like what? Related matters, to the car, a silence. She did not take her eyes from his face. Daniel. Her voice was even. What did you find? He met her gaze. I found what was wrong mechanically and I fixed it. But there's something beyond the mechanical, and I'm not the right person to explain it to you. Frank Calder is. Please call him. His direct line is on the back. He paused. Today if you can. She took the card. Looked at it for a long time. Is it about Warren? She said. Not a question. The flatness of a sentence that has already done its own work. Daniel did not confirm it. Please call Frank. She put the card in her cardigan pocket. All right, she said. He drove home. Daniel had called Frank the morning after he pulled the SEC filing, not the morning after he fixed the car. The morning after he sat at the kitchen table and looked at a number on a regulatory document and understood what that number meant and who had chosen it. That was 3 days before he finished the repair. 3 days before Margaret drove the Porsche out the gate and came back slowly and stood with her hand on the roof. He had not told her anything yet at that point. He needed to be certain, and he needed to know what certain was worth before he decided what to do with it. Frank Calder's office was on Atlantic Street in Stamford. 3rd floor. The kind of space that communicated competence without spending anything on the communication. Frank was 52, gray at the temples, with the unhurried energy of a man who had learned that deliberate produced better results than urgent in almost every situation he had ever encountered. He read everything Daniel brought him in 11 minutes. The engine bay photographs, 24 of them, in sequence. The SEC Form ADV filing, pages 31 through 35, the asset schedule with the Porsche valuation circled. 7 auction comparable printouts with relevant sale prices marked. A 1-page summary Daniel had written at the kitchen table the previous night. Just facts, just sequence, nothing that needed interpretation to be understood. Frank set the last page down. The car is the visible piece, he said. Yes, someone modified the engine in a way that compromises authentication, which supports a lower provenance assessment, which justifies the valuation on the asset schedule. Yes, and the person with authority over both the physical access to the car and the content of the fund's regulatory filings is the operations director, Warren Sloan. Frank was quiet for a moment. You understand what you're describing. Wire fraud at minimum. Breach of fiduciary duty. Possibly more depending on what else has moved through the fund's accounts. Depending on what a forensic accountant finds in the internal records, yes. Possibly significantly more. The car alone represents $1 million gap on a single line item. People who manipulate single line items are rarely doing it in isolation. He paused. If the methodology exists, it's been applied elsewhere. Daniel had thought about this the night before. Had sat with it for a long time at the kitchen table while the apartment was quiet above the bays. She doesn't know, he said. No. She's trusted him to manage everything since her husband died. 14 months. Frank looked at him steadily. Why are you here, Mercer? You're a mechanic. You fixed the car. You could leave it there. Because she asked me to find what was wrong with her car and I found something that isn't about the car. And because the man who taught me this work told me that when you find something that belongs to someone else, you give it back. That's the whole rule. No exceptions for inconvenience. Frank was quiet. Then he reached into his desk drawer and took out a business card. Wrote his direct number on the back. Slid it across the desk. I can't represent you. You're not my client in this matter. But here is what I would tell a client who brought me this. He leaned forward slightly. I would prepare a confidential briefing. I would engage a forensic accountant who specializes in fund irregularities. Her name is Anna Webb. She has worked 15 cases like this in the last 8 years. She knows where money goes when someone is trying to make it disappear gradually. He paused. And I would get this information to Mrs. Holt privately. Through a channel Warren Sloan cannot monitor or anticipate. How? I wouldn't reach out to her. I would let her come to me. You give her this card after the car is fixed. Tell her to call about a related matter. Nothing in writing that passes through the estate systems. Daniel took the card. Will you take her call? If she calls me, yes. Immediately. He paid the consultation rate, walked back to his truck, sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Roy. Roy had lost a client once for telling the truth about what he found in an engine. Had spent 6 weeks eating cheap because the client had gone elsewhere and taken 3 referrals with him. Roy had described this episode without bitterness once as a cup of coffee in the Lancaster garage, the way you describe a weather event you survived. Said, the work is the work. You do it correctly or you don't do it at all. There isn't a third option that lets you sleep. Daniel started the truck. He had a car to finish. November came in cold and stayed that way. Daniel worked. The Audi RS5 went back on the lift. The Volvo XC90 from Westport had an intake issue that turned out to be the most straightforward diagnosis he had made in months. A Jaguar XK8 arrived from Darien, and he almost turned it away because his schedule was full. But it was a 1998 XK8 and he had a weakness for the XK8 that had existed since he was 19 and had never fully resolved itself. So he found room. Ordinary work. Consecutive days of problems with solutions. He was grateful for it. Frank called on a Thursday 3 weeks after Margaret had phoned him. Said only that she had retained him formally. The matter was under privilege and that Anna Webb had already been engaged and was working through Holt Capital's internal records. Frank thanked Daniel for the referral and said he could not share further details. Daniel said he understood and went back to the Jaguar. Anna Webb called him 10 days after that. She identified herself, explained her role, and asked if she could ask Daniel a few specific questions about the engine bay observations. The dates he could attribute to the aftermarket installation, the specific components affected, the technical basis for his assessment that the modification had been deliberate rather than uninformed. The conversation lasted 35 minutes. She asked good questions, precise. She did not ask for more than she needed, and she did not accept approximations when specifics were available. At the end, she said, Mr. Mercer, I want you to understand something. The car was the entry point. What we found inside the fund's accounts is considerably larger. I can't share details while the matter is active, but your observation is what opened the door. How much larger? Daniel said. A pause. The car was one asset among many that had been systematically undervalued or misdirected. The total figure across all affected accounts is in 8 figures. She paused again. Your bracket is what gave us the thread. Everything else unraveled from there. Daniel sat with that after the call ended. 8 figures. 68-year-old widow. 14 months after her husband died. Man she had trusted because her husband had trusted him. He went back to work. Gerald called 4 days after Anna Webb. Elaine Patton had scanned Roy's 1993 records, 22 pages. She had sent them directly to Daniel's email at Gerald's request. Gerald reported this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had solved a logistical problem correctly and wanted it noted. Daniel opened the files that evening after Claire was in bed. Roy's handwriting, small and precise, every decision documented, every modification explained. He read through all 22 pages, and then read the bracket section again, because it deserved a second reading. He thought about Roy spending 7 months on this car, because he had decided it deserved better than it had gotten. He thought about what had happened to it after Harold was no longer there to protect it. He closed the laptop. Checked that Claire's door was pulled to. Turned off the kitchen light, went to bed. He was alone at the bench on the morning of November 23rd. Claire was at school. Mrs. Sullivan was at a medical appointment in Bridgeport. The shop was quiet the way it was quiet when he had complex work and did not want the radio competing with his thinking. The Jaguar was on the lift. He was working through the rear suspension, which had a compliance issue that revealed itself only above 60 miles per hour. He had received a message from Frank the previous evening. Brief. Anna Webb had filed her preliminary findings. The scope was significant. Frank expected federal involvement within the week. Warren Sloan did not know this yet. That was the thing Daniel understood later, reconstructing the sequence. Warren knew that Margaret had retained Frank Calder. He knew, because he had sources inside the estate's administrative staff, that a financial review was underway. What he did not know was that Anna Webb had already found what she was looking for, that the thread had been pulled far enough to see the full pattern, that the federal conversation had already begun. Warren still believed he had time. That was why he came. The front door opened at 10:40. No knock. Daniel looked up from the suspension work. Warren Sloan walked in, charcoal overcoat, dark slacks, shoes that remained expensive because that habit had not broken yet. The September tan was gone. His face had the tightened quality of someone who had been managing something very large for slightly longer than they could manage it comfortably. He walked in the way of a man who had decided before arriving exactly how this conversation would go. Daniel set down his tool. Did not move. Warren looked around the shop. The two bays, the lift, the tool chests, the schedule board on the wall with Claire's school and pickup times in Daniel's handwriting. The coffee maker on the back shelf, with the butterfly stickers Claire had applied in August during what she had described as a necessary decorating phase. He looked at all of it. Nice operation, he said. Daniel said nothing. Warren reached into his coat pocket, took out an envelope. Set it on the workbench to Daniel's left. I'll be brief. $200,000. Wire transfer wherever you want it. In exchange for your complete withdrawal from the Calder matter, you become unavailable. Memory concerns, family emergency, schedule conflict. I don't need a performance. I just need 4 to 6 weeks. The shop was quiet. Daniel looked at the envelope, did not touch it. No, he said. You haven't opened it, I don't need to. Warren looked at him. This is a one-time conversation. Then it ends here. Something shifted in the room, subtle. Warren had come in with one approach and was now selecting the next one from a prepared list. His expression did not change significantly, but the quality of his attention changed. He looked at the schedule board on the wall. Your daughter, Claire. She's at Stamford Academy. His voice remained the same register, smooth, presenting information. Gets out at 3 most days. Mrs. Sullivan picks her up. Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Mrs. Sullivan has appointments, Claire walks to the bus stop on Elm Street herself. A pause. There's a bench near the corner under a maple. She likes it there. The shop went silent in a way that had weight. Daniel was still for exactly 1 second. Then he set down the socket wrench he had been holding, set it in the tray where it belonged, walked around the workbench, stood 3 feet from Warren Sloan. He was not trying to be large. He was simply the nearest solid thing in the room, and he had stopped moving entirely. Get out of my shop, he said. Quiet, completely level. Warren held his gaze, still calculating, still trying to read the variable in front of him. He picked up the envelope from the bench, put it back in his coat pocket, held Daniel's eyes for 1 more second, and left. The bell above the door, then nothing. Daniel stood at the bench, counted to 10, not to calm himself, to confirm that the decision forming in his chest was the correct one, which it was, which it had been from the moment Warren said the name of Claire's school. He picked up his phone, called Jim Farrell. Greenwich PD, the original local contact on the Holt matter. Farrell, it's Daniel Mercer. Witness intimidation. My shop on Pacific Street. 10 minutes ago. Who? Warren Sloan. Offered $200,000 for my withdrawal from the Calder matter. When I declined, he named my daughter's school, her pickup schedule, the bus stop she uses on Elm Street, the bench she sits on. By name, by time, by location. Silence for 3 seconds. He came to you directly, yes. I'm calling the New Haven field office in 10 minutes. Don't go anywhere. I have to collect my daughter at 3. We'll have someone at the school before noon. Mercer. A pause. You called immediately. Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Daniel ended the call. Then called Mrs. Sullivan and asked her to collect Claire from inside the school building today, not the bus stop, at 2:45, and to wait inside with her until Daniel arrived. Mrs. Sullivan said she would be there at 2:30. He put the phone in his pocket, looked at the Jaguar on the lift. The rear suspension compliance issue above 60 miles per hour was still there. The problem had not changed because of what had just happened in his shop. Work continued regardless. He picked up his tool, went back under the car. That evening, after collecting Claire after dinner after she was asleep, his phone showed a message from Frank. 3 sentences. FBI New Haven field office contacted. Search warrant applications filed. Stand by. He read it twice. The thing was moving now under its own weight. It had been moving since September, since a microfiber cloth cleaned a stamp on a bracket in a Greenwich garage. But now it was moving in a different way. In a way that did not require anything further from Daniel, except to tell the truth when asked. He turned off the lamp on the kitchen counter, checked Claire's door, went to bed. The courthouse on Church Street was gray in January. Everything in New Haven was gray in January. The sidewalks, the sky. The faces of people moving between buildings with their collars turned up and their eyes forward. January in Connecticut does not apologize for itself. It arrives on its own terms and stays until it decides otherwise. Daniel drove down from Stamford on a Thursday morning. He had left at 6:10, earlier than necessary, because he wanted to drop Claire at school himself, rather than have Mrs. Sullivan do it. He had been doing that more often since November, not because of anything specific that remained. The protective detail had ended 3 weeks after Warren's arrest. The school had been notified the situation was resolved. Everything on the surface had returned to ordinary, but he drove her himself anyway. Claire had been awake when his alarm went off. She was at the kitchen table with her cereal and the wooden car beside the bowl, already dressed in her school uniform, which meant she had set her own alarm the night before without telling him. "You have court today," she said. "Yes, in New Haven, yes." She moved her spoon through the cereal slowly. "Are you going to tell them everything? That's what witnesses do." She considered this. "Even the part about me." He looked at her. "Even that part," he said, "because it matters." She nodded once with the gravity she brought to things she had decided were serious. "Okay." She went back to her cereal. "Will you be back for dinner?" "I'll be back for..." She accepted this and did not ask again. He drove her to Stamford Academy, watched her go through the front doors. She turned at the top of the steps and raised one hand in the wave she had been doing since she was 4. The same gesture Sarah had used leaving a room, an unconscious inheritance that still caught him off guard sometimes when he was not braced for it. He had been braced for it this morning. He got on I-95 South. The federal courthouse was on Church Street in the way that federal buildings occupy space in medium-sized cities, with a solidity that is meant to communicate permanence. Stone steps, heavy doors, interior ceilings high enough that your voice sounds like it belongs to someone slightly more important than you actually are. Frank met him in the lobby at 8:40. Gray suit, quiet tie. The expression of a man who had been inside courtrooms enough times that the ritual no longer produced any feeling in either direction, which was its own kind of professional achievement. "You know what you're going to say," Frank said. "I know what I saw. Same thing in this case." Frank almost smiled. "That's exactly what you want." They went through security, long corridor. They sat on a bench outside courtroom 4 and waited. Margaret was already there, 10 feet down the hallway with her attorney Patricia Hess, a woman Daniel had met once briefly in October. Margaret wore a navy coat. Her hands were in her lap. She looked up when they sat down. She nodded at Daniel. He nodded back. That was sufficient. Warren Sloan was already at the defense table when they were led in. He was thinner than September. The quality of his suit remained unchanged because some habits outlast the circumstances that created them. He looked at the defense table in front of him when Daniel entered and did not look up. The prosecutor was Carol Briggs. Face, short hair, the focused attention of someone who had decided a long time ago that performing competence was less efficient than simply being competent. She had called Daniel twice in December to go over his testimony. Both calls had ended with the same question. "Anything you want to add that we haven't covered?" Both times Daniel had said no, because there was nothing to add. What he knew was what he had seen and what he had done with what he had seen. The bracket, the pump, the installation marks, the SEC filing, the conversation in his shop on November 23rd. Every detail had a timestamp. Every claim had documentation. He had written things down the day they happened because Roy had told him to always write things down the day they happened. That memory was a worse record keeper than people believed. and that if you were ever in a room where someone disputed what you found, you wanted paper. Daniel had paper. He testified for 47 minutes. He described the initial inspection on September 17th, the bracket geometry, what it was, why it differed from factory specification, how he recognized Roy Patton's specific approach and why that recognition was reliable. He described the aftermarket pump and its installation. He walked through each of the 4 contact points and explained what each one required the installer to know about what was already present in the engine bay. He described finding the valuation discrepancy, how he accessed the SEC filing, what the auction comparables showed and what they meant, why the gap between the listed value and the market value of a car with documented Roy Patton provenance was not a methodology question but a directional one. He described Anna Webb's role, how she had been engaged through Frank Calder following Daniel's initial findings, how her examination of Holt Capital's internal accounts had identified a pattern of systematic asset undervaluation and misdirection across multiple line items, of which the Porsche was the most visible and the first discovered, and how the total figure across all affected assets had been established by her forensic review at $14, 2 million. He described November 23rd in his shop, the envelope, the amount, Warren Sloan naming Claire's school, her pickup time, Mrs. Sullivan, the bus stop on Elm Street, the bench under the maple. He said all of it the same way, level, factual, without addition or reduction. The events had their own weight and did not need his assistance to carry it. Carol Briggs moved through the material in sequence, clean questions. She gave each piece room before moving to the next. She did not rush anything that should not be rushed. The cross-examination lasted 8 minutes. The defense attorney asked Daniel twice whether he was certain about the bracket geometry. Daniel said yes both times without elaboration. He asked whether Daniel had any formal training in financial analysis or securities law. Daniel said no to both. He asked whether Daniel had any prior relationship with Margaret Holt before September 17th. No, Daniel said. So you had no prior stake in any matter involving Holt Capital Management. I had a stake in the car being fixed correctly. The defense attorney paused, moved on. There was nothing structural to dispute. The bracket was documented in photographs taken before anything was touched. The pump installation was documented with part numbers and contact point analysis. The SEC filing was public record. Anna Webb's forensic findings were filed and admitted. The phone records from Daniel's call to Jim Farrell on November 23rd were time-stamped to within 4 minutes of Warren's departure from the shop. Everything had been written down the day it happened. Daniel stepped down at 11:17 and returned to the gallery. The judge was Eleanor Marsh, late 50s. Reading glasses she handled with the precision of someone who knew exactly when she needed them. She had reviewed the plea agreement Warren had entered 2 weeks earlier, after his defense strategy had become untenable following the addition of the witness tampering count. She sentenced Warren Sloan to 36 months in federal custody, restitution of $14, $2 million, to Holt Capital Management drawn from the forensic accounting of Anna Webb's findings, permanent bar from the financial services industry. She addressed the witness tampering count directly and at length. The defendant visited the home of a cooperating witness, she said, offered a substantial financial inducement to purchase his silence, and when refused, invoked the daily routine of that witness's 7-year-old daughter with a specificity that indicates prior surveillance of a child. The court considers this not an impulsive act but a calculated one. It reflects the same deliberate methodology the defendant applied throughout the broader scheme, and it is reflected in this sentence. Warren looked at the table in front of him. His attorney said nothing. The courtroom held the particular quiet that follows a sentence being read aloud, a collective breath, a room adjusting to what has just become official and permanent. Daniel looked at his hands in his lap. He thought about Claire at the kitchen table that morning, moving her spoon through her cereal. Even the part about me? Yes, because it matters, it had mattered. He walked out at 12:50. The January sky was the color that follows a storm that has taken all its drama with it on the way out. Not quite blue, not quite gray, clean, cold. The air had the dryness that meant the temperature would drop again after dark. He stood on the stone steps. Margaret came out behind him. Her attorney was still inside on a call. Margaret stood beside Daniel and looked at Church Street without speaking for a moment. 36 months, she said. Yes, and the restitution. Yes, she was quiet. A city bus went past. A man in a puffy coat walked a dog that was deeply unbothered by the cold. Harold would have been furious, Margaret said. He was not a man who forgave betrayal. Not in any form, not at any scale. A pause. But I think he would have been glad about the rest of it. About how it was found. Daniel looked at the street. A mechanic with a flashlight, she said. And something in her voice was not irony. It was genuine. He did not respond to that directly. Go home, Margaret said, not unkindly. You said you'd be back for dinner. He looked at her. Claire told you that. She called me 2 weeks ago. Margaret's expression did something careful and warm at the same time. She found my number in your recent calls and borrowed your phone while you were in the shower. She wanted to know if I had any pasta recipes she hadn't tried. She said you'd been making the same 3 and the situation needed addressing. Daniel stared. She's thorough, Margaret said. She's 7. She's thorough, Margaret repeated. He drove home. He picked Claire up from school himself at 3. She came through the front doors with her backpack and the wooden car in her coat pocket, the shape of it visible through the fabric. She saw his truck and broke into her small contained run. She got in the passenger side and buckled her seatbelt and looked at him. How did it go? It went well. Did you tell them everything? Everything, she nodded. Looked forward through the windshield. Good, she said, with the finality of someone closing a file. He made dinner that night from a recipe. Margaret had apparently texted Claire directly. A pasta, with a brown butter sauce and sage that was more involved than his usual rotation, and that required him to ask Claire twice whether she was sure she had copied it down right. Because the steps seemed out of order. But the steps turned out to be correct, and the result was better than anything he had made in months. Which, Claire acknowledged with the restraint of someone trying not to seem too satisfied about being right. They ate at the kitchen table. Claire told him about something her friend had done that was either deeply funny or a genuine injustice. The distinction remained unclear through the entire account. And he listened to all of it and asked one question at the end. That was the right question, because she launched immediately into a second story. After dinner, she helped him clear the table, which was new behavior she had started in October, and which he had not commented on because commenting on it seemed likely to end it. He washed, she dried. Badly, because she was 7 and drying dishes was not yet a skill she had prioritized. But she did it. He read to her for half an hour. They were working through a book about a girl who discovers that the lighthouse near her town has been sending signals for 50 years and no one knew. Claire had opinions about every chapter. She expressed these opinions at length during the reading, which meant 30 minutes of book took 50 minutes in practice. But Daniel had stopped trying to compress this. He turned off her light at 8:30. She was asleep by the time he reached the door. He knew because her breathing changed and she stopped holding the wooden car quite so deliberately and let her hand relax around it. He pulled the door to. Margaret came to the shop on the last Wednesday of January. January 29th, 2:11 in the afternoon. Claire would be home in just under an hour. Daniel was under the Jaguar XK8, working through a brake line that had developed a slow weep at the rear left fitting. The kind of problem that announces itself by being slightly worse on a predictable schedule, until it becomes very bad very quickly. He had been putting off this particular job because the access was awkward and required patience he had been directing elsewhere for the past several months. He heard the bell above the front door. He rolled out from under the car. Margaret Holt stood near the entrance in a navy wool coat. Silver hair, a package under her arm, brown paper, tied with kitchen twine in the way of someone who does not wrap things often, and had approached the task with appropriate seriousness. She looked around the shop, took her time with it. The 2 bays, the lift, the tool chests, the schedule board on the wall with Claire's school written in Daniel's handwriting. The coffee maker on the back shelf with the butterfly stickers. Harold would have liked this place, she said. Daniel wiped his hands on a shop rag. Why? Because it's exactly what it says it is. She looked at his name above the bench, nothing else on the sign. He had very little patience for anything that presented itself as more than it was. She held out the package. He took it, light, firm, the shape of something he knew before he had unwrapped it, the way you recognize a voice before you place the name. Gerald Ashe contacted Elaine Patton after the sentencing, Margaret said. He told her everything. What you found in September, what you did with it, what it led to. She paused. Elaine said she wanted you to have this. She said her father would have wanted the same thing. He unwrapped it. Brown paper, then a cloth wrap beneath, and inside the cloth a book. Leather cover, dark brown, worn at the corners in the way of something handled often over many years. Pages thick and faintly yellowed at the edges. No title on the cover. Only initials pressed into the leather at the lower right corner, deliberate and small. R.P. Roy Patton. Not the scanned pages Gerald had emailed in November, not a copy made for an archive or a museum or a legal proceeding. The original. Daniel sat down on his stool. He did not rush. He opened the cover, Roy's handwriting on the first page. Small, consistent. The handwriting of a man who had spent a working life making notes in margins where space was limited and carelessness was waste. The records ran chronologically. Each entry dated. Each car described with the same attention Roy brought to the physical work. Part numbers, modification rationale, observations about what a specific engine needed and why it needed it. He turned pages carefully. Page 7. A 1973 Porsche Carrera RS Grand Prix White arrived February 14, 1993. Condition on arrival, poor. Owner's instruction, do it correctly or not at all. Roy's note at the top. He means it, so do I. 7 pages of Roy's handwriting covering the full scope of the work. The bracket appeared on page 4 of the entry, with a diagram in the margin, the geometry labeled in millimeters. The physics of oil behavior under lateral load at sustained speed, stated in the plain language of someone who understood it well enough to strip away the complexity. The reason the factory specification was inadequate for a car that would be driven the way this one deserved to be driven. Daniel read those pages twice. Then he turned to the final page of the entry. Roy had written a closing note on each car. Always brief. Sometimes just a date and a single word. This one was longer. The car went to a man in Connecticut. His name was Harold. He drove out from Fairfield County to collect it himself rather than send someone. He walked around the car once, then asked to see the engine. I opened the cover. He stood at the rear and looked for about a minute without speaking. Then he reached in and ran his hand along the bracket. Not touching anything functional. Just the bracket. He nodded once and stepped back. He didn't ask what it was or why the angle was different from factory. He ran his hand along it and nodded. I charged him what we agreed and he paid without discussion. He shook my hand and drove home. Those are the ones you do the work for. Not because they understand the details. Because they understand that someone cared enough to get the details right. That's all it takes. That's actually everything. Daniel stopped reading. He sat with it. Harold Holt in Roy's garage in Lancaster in 1994. Running his hand along the bracket, not asking what it was, understanding that someone had cared, nodding 30 years of Tuesday mornings. And then, a bracket stamp on the underside of a bracket in a Greenwich garage, found by someone who had watched those same hands work in Lancaster 15 years after Harold drove away. The knowledge had survived because Roy had written it down, because Elaine had kept the book, because Gerald had known to call her, and because Daniel had been in that garage in 2009 and had paid attention. That was the chain. That was how it worked. Not dramatically, not by design, just by people doing their jobs carefully enough that the work outlasted them. Margaret was standing near the workbench. She had been watching him read without speaking. What does it say? She asked. It says Harold came to Lancaster himself to collect the car. Drove from Fairfield County. Daniel looked up. Roy wrote that Harold looked at the engine and ran his hand along the bracket without asking what it was. She went very still. He understood that someone had cared about it, Daniel said. Roy wrote that was enough. That it was actually everything. Margaret looked at the book. She looked at it the way you look at something that has answered a question you did not know you had been carrying. A question so old you had stopped feeling it as a question and had started feeling it as just a feature of the landscape. He never told me about that trip, she said. Her voice was steady. He went to Pennsylvania in the spring of 1994. Came back with the car and said very little about it. I thought it was Harold being Harold. He didn't narrate himself. He just did things and the doing was the explanation. He understood what he was buying. He understood who had built it. She was quiet for a moment. He just never needed to say so. Roy didn't need him to. She looked at the closing note, though she could not read it from where she stood. 30 years, she said. Not to Daniel particularly. To the fact of it, he drove it twice a week for 30 years, Tuesday mornings. Saturdays. He always got out slowly when he came back. Like the drive wasn't finished yet. Daniel thought about taking the car out in September. The way it communicated through the steering. The way the engine sat close enough that you felt it as information rather than noise. The way you did not want to hurry getting out. He understood the slowness. Elaine said you can keep it as long as you need to, Margaret said. She wants it back eventually. But no deadline. She said it belongs with someone who knows what it is for now. He looked at Roy's initials on the cover. Thank you, he said, for bringing it yourself. Thank Elaine. And Gerald, she put on her gloves. She was nearly to the door when she stopped and turned back. Daniel, he looked up. Lime Rock Park called me last week. They're developing a restoration program. A permanent workshop for vintage cars, preservation work and education combined. A working shop where people learn by doing. They're looking for a senior technical lead. She paused. Gerald gave them your name. He told them Roy Patton had trained you personally and that in his opinion you were the best natural mechanic Roy had ever worked with in 30 years on the circuit. Daniel was quiet. The pay is less than you make here, she said. Significantly less. It's structured as a non-profit. I want you to know that before you think about it. A pause. But Gerald said it's the work you used to do. The real work. And Lime Rock is 43 minutes from Stamford. I checked. You checked. I did. She held his gaze. You could keep this shop. Run both for a while. Find an arrangement that works. They're not asking for a commitment. They asked if you would have a conversation. Why did you look up the distance? She was quiet for a moment. Because you did something in September that had nothing to do with your job and everything to do with who you are, she said. And I have spent 4 months trying to find something that fit that. This is what I found. Daniel looked at Roy's book on the bench. Those are the ones you do the work for. He thought about standing at a bench at Lime Rock and teaching someone what Roy had taught him. Not the procedures, not the part numbers, the way you listened before you touched anything, the way you documented before you changed anything, the way you understood the intention behind a design before you decided what it needed, the way knowledge moved from one person's hands to another's, and survived across years and distances and garages you would never see, solving problems the original person could not have anticipated, for people they would never meet. Just a conversation, he said. That's all. He nodded once. She left, the bell above the door, and then quiet. Daniel sat with Roy's book in his hands for a while. He turned back to the closing note of the 1993 entry. Read the last line one more time. That's all it takes. That's actually everything. He closed the book carefully, set it on the back corner of the workbench where it would not be in the way of the work but would be visible from anywhere in the shop. Looked at it once. Then he heard the front door open again. He looked up. Claire stood in the doorway with her backpack on one shoulder and the wooden car in her hand. She was 12 minutes early. Had apparently walked from the bus stop herself, which she was technically allowed to do since October when the protective detail had ended, which did not mean he had entirely gotten used to it. She looked at the Jaguar on the lift, looked at Roy's book on the bench, looked at him. Who brought the book? Mrs. Holt. Claire walked over and looked at the cover without touching it, the worn leather, Roy's initials at the lower right corner. Is it important? Yes. She studied it for a moment, with the seriousness she brought to things she had decided deserved it. Okay, she said. She went to the stool near the workbench and sat down and put the wooden car on the bench beside Roy's book. The two objects side by side. Black walnut, 2 inches long, 4 wheels, and a leather-bound record of 7 months of work on a car that had traveled through 30 years and 2 states and multiple pairs of hands before arriving here. Claire did not say anything else. She got out her homework and started working on it. Daniel looked at the 2 objects on the bench for a moment. Then he picked up his tool and went back under the Jaguar. The brake line was not going to fix itself. Claire had homework. He had 40 minutes before he needed to start dinner. The new pasta with brown butter and sage, which Claire had sourced herself through channels, he was still slightly amazed by, which had turned out to be better than anything in his regular rotation, which he had now made 3 times. He would make it again tonight. He slid under the car. The fitting was right where he had left it. The work was exactly what it had been. The problem had not changed while he was away from it, and it would not change now that he was back. He started where he had stopped, one thing at a time, done completely, before the next thing began.